The 29th of July 2019. The Moscow people are far away from the street protests. They are enjoying the music of German rock band Rammstein. And then this happens. The band's two guitarists kiss. Briefly but clearly. That same day, Rammstein publishes a picture of the kiss on Instagram. The caption is in Russian. And, excuse my accent, it says, Россия, мы любим тебя. Russia, we love you. Russian state-funded media did report about the concert, but, as you may expect, they avoided telling readers about Rammstein's Russian kiss. No surprise, because Russia is among the most anti-LGBT countries of Europe, right? Legally and politically, yes, there's no doubt that this is true. Rammstein could very well be punished for what they did on stage. And they probably would if they weren't German and insanely famous in Russia. But how homophobic is Russia really? From the perspective of music history, you'd be surprised to see a very different image of Russia. In the European pop music of the last decades, Russia is not only a flourishing space of LGBT music, it's a trendsetter. Does Russia have a more dominant LGBT scene than the rest of Europe? Or is it about something else? Something that's about Russia's peculiar relation with the rest of Europe. A relation that goes way back into history. We are talking this episode with Roman Gerasimov, a Russian journalist and the most pop music obsessed guy I've ever met. With him, we'll get into the story of two Russian music acts that shook Europe. We'll talk about T.a.T.u, a group of two girls who took over the pop charts of Europe and Japan in the early 2000s, shocking audiences by making out on stage. The second group is Pussy Riot, an anarchist punk group who managed to get in the center of European and American attention after its members were jailed for religious hatred in 2012. But first, we're gonna give you an update on Europe's most significant developments of the last week. So you are prepared for the upcoming week. You're listening to Speaking of Europe. Hey guys, my name is Jules.
And my name is Darren.
And we are at the very beginning of Estonia's autumn.
Yeah.
It's rainy and cold and windy. It's getting gray. Summer is really gone, at least here in the northeast of Europe.
I don't think it's gonna come back. I think that's it.
I'm afraid you're right. But that doesn't stop us from drinking our martini.
In an ice cream cup.
Because we don't have anything else. Oh, that hurt your ears, right? Yes. Let's start with the news that has been most dominant in Europe this week. And I think that news was coming from Italy.
And I think we can also proudly say that's something we foresaw in our first episode of
yes,
this
that's
podcast
true.
with
Yeah.
Federico. So what happened in the last week was that the very shaky coalition between the Five Star Movement and Lega in Italy seems to be cracking.
Yeah, we actually talked about how cracky this coalition has been from the beginning.
Yeah.
And we talked about that in the first episode. So you have to keep it very short. Two parties governing Italy, both are being labeled as populist.
Well,
one of them is far right and the other one is
anti-establishment.
Yeah, the other one is just classically populist. It consists of former right-wing and left-wing politicians.
Matteo Salvini, the leader of Lega,
the far-right party.
The far-right party, and also the deputy prime minister of Italy, quoted a number of disagreements between his party and Five Star Movement. But apparently what was the last nail in the coffin, according to Euronews, was on a disagreement on a high-speed Alpine rail link with France that would connect Turin in Italy to Lyon in France.
Isn't that fun? The Eurosceptic far-right party wants to break the coalition because he wanted to connect Italy to the rest of Europe.
Right. And the reason why the anti-establishment party, Five Star movement, opposed to that was because of the costs of it.
Yeah.
That they didn't want to go through with it.
Yeah.
So the coalition fell.
Yeah. Also taking place right now, and we should take that into consideration, is that the far-right party of Salvini is ahead in the polls.
Yes. In the last May, in the European Parliament elections, they had I think 34% of the votes. So they are the most likely definitive winners of a possible election. So they are at the height of their popularity, and as a politically smart move, they want to make use of that.
Yeah, they want to jump on the train.
Yeah. So there are weird flirtations going on between certain actors in Italian politics.
Right.
The first flirtation is between Salvini and Berlusconi, and the other flirtation is between a weirder flirtation, obviously, between Five Stars and the center-left Democratic Party.
Yeah.
It's weird because when the elections took place last year, was it last year?
Mm-hmm.
When the elections took place last year, the two parties refused to be in a coalition.
The left-wing Democratic Party and the Five Star movement.
Yeah, but now they are speaking of possible coalition to avert Lega winning the elections.
Right.
Possible early elections.
Yeah. We will definitely talk more about that next week, guys. I really would have loved to talk about it this time. But honestly, if you listen to the first episode of this podcast, which was, now looking back at it, kind of a preparation for talking about the breaking coalition in Italy, you would agree with me that I should really have this conversation with Federico Giovannini, who is very much specialized in the political mess in Italy. And so we will. Next weekend he is free, so I will take that opportunity to talk about it with him.
There was apparently, I didn't even hear about it, terrorist attack to a mosque in Norway.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, nobody died, luckily. I think one man was injured while trying to stop the terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
The attacker said that he was inspired by the New Zealand attacker and the El Paso shooter.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any good news from Europe?
We do have some good news, and it's something I would really love to talk about in this episode, but unfortunately we don't have much time. It's the fact that weed is finally going to be legalized and regulated in a European country. And guess what? It's not my home country of the Netherlands. It's going to be Luxembourg. So, yay!
It's almost your home country.
It's very close, yeah. It's part of the Benelux, so it's kind of my homeland,
Benelux
right?
is one country.
Shout out to Luxembourg, honk, honk, honk. Well, hey, by the way, some of my family lives there, so
I thought
I
you're
have some
definitely Luxembourg.
I have some Luxembourgian blood.
Do you say Luxembourgian or Luxembourg?
I think Luxembourgian, yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure, actually.
I think it's Luxembourgish.
Maybe
that's my fantasy, I don't know.
What about you, Luxembourgian listeners? What do you think is the proper adjective
if there's
for
any.
your country? Oh, that's so mean, Jared. Well, this is of course a bit of a bittersweet newsflash for me, because it's great from my perspective that cannabis is becoming legal in a European country, because I would very much support such a legalization. But it's also a bit painful for me, because it reminds me of the fact that in the Netherlands, weed is still not really legal.
I was shocked about that. I mean, maybe it's again me, but I've been to Netherlands quite a few times by now, and
yeah, you kind of lived there for 3 months.
I kind of lived there, and I didn't know that it's not legal.
Yeah, no, it's just legally tolerated, so you won't get arrested for smoking, buying, or even selling it. That's all fine. But what is illegal in the Netherlands is making the weed, producing the weed. So, and And of course, that's a bit surrealistic, right? Because how can you sell, buy, or smoke weed when it's not produced, right? So basically, the whole weed economy in the Netherlands is based on don't ask, don't tell. I promise you guys, I will be speaking about this. I will be talking about this. More specifically, I want to dive into the question, why is this still not legal in the Netherlands? But Europe is changing every week, and every time a more important topic is popping up. Next week we're gonna talk about the Italian coalition crisis
and the possible snap elections.
Yes, so let's hope not much will happen in the week afterwards, so we can dive into the cannabis question.
Talk about the weed. Did you hear anything about the Burqa ban in Netherlands in its first week? Did you come across anything?
Yeah, we talked about it so much last week.
And I didn't hear about anything.
Well, I did notice that there were a lot of protests going on in the Netherlands. I even heard of some Dutch non-Muslims wearing burqas out of protest.
But also some Dutch Muslims, like this Turkish PvdA deputy.
Yeah, there's Turkish-Dutch, a social democrat. Yeah, she was like very explicit about saying, hey, if you are liberal or social democrat or socialist for that matter, you should really oppose the burqa because it goes against all the values that we stand for. So yeah, it just shows again how much of a complicated subject this is, I guess. So let's go back to Russia. Right.
As usual.
Enjoy. It's Roman Gerasimov.
Yeah.
I am today with Roman Gerasimov. We're together here in Tallinn.
Hello there.
Thank you for visiting me. You are a Russian journalist and you have worked for a while for Yandex.
Well, he's making it a bit too posh, but yeah, that's quite right. Yeah, thank you for hosting me.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. It's really interesting. We are, however, not really going to talk about Yandex or anything related to Russian IT. We're going to talk about your true passion, I could say, right? And that's the music industry.
Kind of, yeah. You're making it sound like I don't like my job at all and like I hate everything at the moment. So it's not true. Don't fire me, please.
And we're going to specifically talk about the Russian music industry. If you want to describe the Russian music industry today in one sentence, how would you describe it?
I mean, I think one word would be enough, really, a mess. Because obviously it takes up from different trends that were there in Europe and mostly in America a couple of years back, and also tries to catch up with all the new, like, rap-ish sound, that's hip-hop sound that also is very trendy at the moment in the US, and they try to catch up very badly, and what comes out of it is absolutely unhealthy and not exactly quality music overall that becomes very popular with the masses.
And that's really interesting because when we think in Western Europe about Russian music, if we think about it at all, then we're thinking, I think, about the very controversial music that Russia has produced in the last 15 years. Pussy Riot is probably the most recent example of that. But it actually goes back to T.a.T.u.
Right.
I'm surprised about how two extremely popular acts in European pop music on the LGBT topic are coming from, we could say, one of the least LGBT friendly countries in Europe.
Right.
Yeah, why is that?
That's a very interesting question, but I mean, we should understand that. Disclaimer, T.a.T.u, the members of T.a.T.u, whose name was Yulia Volkova and Yelena Katina, they were not lesbians, unlike they were trying to portray themselves.
Yeah, let's describe T.a.T.u for a second, right?
Yeah,
because
sure.
T.a.T.u was a popular a pop music duo from Russia. from the early 2000s. They got popular through Eurovision, I believe.
No, before that.
Before Eurovision, right?
Earlier, yeah.
But they did join Eurovision, right? I think.
Yes, and they took third place, I believe. It was 2003. They were very unhappy about it because by then the UK public vote didn't give them a single point, which was to them an absolute nonsense. So yeah, that was the case as well. But that really shows that they were very popular amongst Europeans.
Yes. And why were they popular among Europeans in the early 2000s?
It's a good question in terms of the fact that they somehow got into the genre of dance pop that was very popular back in 2000 in Europe as well. Like you have heard the obvious hits that are All the Things She Said, for example, which is this very fast-paced, almost rock/pop anthemic kind of structure, which was very popular back in the day. And it somehow mixed very weird Eastern European harmonies into the sound. If you could notice that it's not your typical European pop song.
Yeah.
If you think about this. And
as far as I understand, that song really was just about lesbian romantic adventure, right?
Exactly. Oddly enough, it was first written in Russian. In Russia, there's no representation of LGBT community in a pop sphere, like in the popular pop. Maybe it all comes from the 90s when their story started in 1999. I don't remember exactly what happened then. But they were discovered somehow, and the 90s in Russia were obviously a bit of a time of where culturally people were trying on different things. It also was a bit of a mess, but it was like an adventurous mess.
Because we're talking about Russia right after the 90s, the first years of the presidency of Vladimir Putin.
Exactly, yeah.
A lot of Europeans, including Russians, thought or still believed that Russia was in the transition zone of becoming a full-fledged democracy, right?
That's correct. That's very interesting to look at. Yeah.
So this was really in a time when people thought everything is still possible.
Exactly, yeah. Because this was the time when Russia started going out of the stagnation that was caused by collapse of the sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Soviet Union, yeah. Russia.
Not the European Union.
No,
no. The other union.
The other union, Right, so Russia was just at the middle of going out of the stagnation that was caused by the collapse of the Soviet Union and different economic failures that were during the 90s. Russians were very much believing that something was, as you said, something was possible to do, and they were really trying to go the European way, which was interesting.
Right.
And T.a.T.u is somehow is one of the flagships of this movement in the music industry, I'd say.
You were just saying that Russian music already back then was not generally very pro-LGBT.
Yeah.
Yet, of all countries, the biggest LGBT act in European pop music in the early 2000s came from Russia. Yeah, why is this? I can't really grasp that. Why didn't T.a.T.u come from France or Germany?
Because nobody would be surprised, would they? Because, to my mind, T.a.T.u is a project when Russians started tipping their feet into the sand of European pop music. They were trying to understand what would it take for Russian pop scene to come into the big European and world pop scene. And I think this was the moment where they could go basically extreme on everything. They could try different extreme points, from going lesbian to, I don't know, going absolutely radical, whatever movement you name it, I think. And this was one of the efforts that worked very well. Yeah. I think T.a.T.u is an example of a very good management in the first place, because the musical material, honestly, and obviously the vocal capabilities of these two were by far not the best ones. if you ask me. So it was very well managed, and then at some point when they started understanding that this thing was working, when they understood that the English versions of the songs were somehow performing well in the charts of Europe and the UK, they realized that maybe this was the way they should go, and then they invited very well-known Western producers. This was really Russian music business trying to dip its feet into the world of European pop music.
Yeah, so it's partly Russia starting to experiment really with their freedom,
right?
Like testing how far they could actually go as artists, and at the same time, it was maybe the opening of the Russian music industry towards the rest of the world, right?
You're right.
And it's also interesting that two women kissing in school uniforms,
right,
if I remember well, was not just provocative for Russia. 2002 was 1 year after the Netherlands, as the first country in the world, legalized gay marriage.
Yeah.
That's legalizing gay marriage. That is not fully embracing it as a mainstream culture, right?
Exactly.
And that strikes me a lot, that Russia was itself very much fighting with its own definition of LGBT culture,
right,
but at the same time, they were in many ways so much ahead.
They were. I think, once again, that's the question of good management. As I said, the members of T.a.T.u are not actually lesbian. They were paid to pretend that they were, and they felt quite uncomfortable, as they said later in the interviews. I think that's the question of a good understanding of the business itself, trying to understand what would sell and what wouldn't.
So, if I understand it correctly, the first mainstream LGBT act in European pop music was really just a successful product of the capitalization of Russia.
Indeed. I think it's, and it's very curious, I know, because it somehow shows how orchestrated the whole industry is, basically. How easy it is to sell something like this. Indeed, one of them, I think it was Yulia Volkova actually, one of them is a strong anti-LGBT activist, not activist, but
an anti-LGBT figure.
Yes.
Whereas she is at the same time one of the
yes,
embodiments of
correct,
LGBT mainstream culture.
Correct. If you and once again, it shows very well how what the industry would do to a person in order to stay relevant, at least within their own country. Mm-hmm. Because this way, it's very hard to be somewhat gay friendly and be famous in Russia at the same time.
Let's move forward 10 years.
Right.
We're in Russia 2012.
Great.
We're in a completely different Russia.
Yes.
As 10 years before that, Putin's Russia is very much characterized by the 2012 protests,
right,
by mostly youngsters and high educated,
right,
who are mostly disenchanted with Putin's promises to democratize the Russian Federation,
right,
which didn't really happen in those years, and people finally start to realize that a democratic Russia cannot really be taken for granted.
Right.
And after the protests, Russia is actually severely moving towards authoritarianism, because I think President Putin realizes he has to govern with a more iron fist in order to not make the country escalate and revolt against him. And a new band pops up, also rooted in the LGBT community, and also both shaking Russia and the rest of Europe, which is Pussy Riot.
Черные рясы, золотые погоны, все прихожане ползут на поклоны, призрак свободы на небесах. И правда отправится в мир, когда
Great. Yeah.
Why? What was the moment that Pussy Riot enchanted Europe?
Well, I'm not sure about Europe, not that I've studied it a lot, but indeed the moment that they started their journey through Russian media and all that was in March 2012, which was before actually the Bolotnaya Square protests. This was what they called a punk prayer. So what they did was they invaded the Christ the Savior Cathedral, which is
the most important church of the Russian Orthodox community.
Yes, the one that has been rebuilt after the Soviets had burnt it down. So what they did, they invaded this church and started singing. What they wore this like socks on the heads. They were certainly not dressed the way that you would go into an Orthodox cathedral.
In case you are not watching this podcast, let me describe what is happening here. A bunch of women in colored masks are entering the altar of the church. They start to scream, play a guitar and dance. A security guy is trying to stop them. First calmly, then more aggressively. We see a nun trying to stop people from watching and filming the happening.
That was their very big statement. They called it, as I said, the punk prayer.
And it was kind of a protest against the patriarchy, right?
It was, yes.
Both literally and figuratively, because I
exactly.
think in Russia, this is important to understand for many Europeans, patriarchy has a double meaning. It can mean patriarchy as feminists understand it, a masculine-dominated societal system. But the patriarchy, quite literally, in Russia is referring to the church.
Correct. So the
Russian
leader,
Orthodox Church.
Yes. So the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, who basically has almost the same amount of power that the president might have, is the patriarch or patriarch, as we call him in Russian. So yes, obviously this punk prayer had a very, very obvious double meaning.
It was a protest, in other words, against both patriarchy as a society as well as the theocratic part of the Russian political system.
That's right. Despite the fact that Russia is considered a state where church stands somewhat on the side from politics, which really isn't the case, because it still has a lot of power on what decisions are being made, actually, recently there has been a law that under which nobody is allowed to undermine the feelings of the believers. Pussy Riot is a punk group that is radical feminists, and like radical feminists. All of them come from a movement called Vayna, or war. And one of that movement's first performances was in the State Biological Museum in Moscow in 2008, when just before the elections of the president of Russian Federation that were evidently won by Dmitry Medvedev, the successor and the predecessor of Putin.
Yeah, so you had like 4 years.
4 years of complete power.
Of a break between the first Putin period and the second Putin period. And Medvedev was a relatively liberal and pro-European president, although that might be a discussion for another episode.
Indeed, yeah, but he certainly was seen by many as the spark of liberalism after a stagnation of Putin's regime in 2007. Yeah. So what happened was, in this biological museum, they made a performance called. Is it allowed to swear on your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So the performance was called "Fuck for Bear the Ancestor." So,
So can you say that again?
fuck for the bear that is the ancestor of Putin, because the bear, the surname of Medvedev is actually translated as the bear.
Yeah.
So that's the root of the word.
And bear is also, at least unofficially, considered
A symbol of Russia.
Yeah, the symbol of Russia, like the eagle is for America.
Indeed, yes. And the essence of this performance was that there were like 5 couples having sex in this museum, and 2 activists that were holding the paper that said. So we should understand that their background is very radical.
Yeah, and it basically was giving the finger to both President Putin as well as to future President Medvedev. Right?
That was the case with the war. That was the case with the war movement. Unlike T.a.T.u, as we spoke earlier, Pussy Riot is not a managed project. I think it's quite possible to compare them to Hatari, the Icelandic Eurovision act this year.
Yes, this was Hatred Will Prevail.
Exactly, yeah, and
Yeah.
how they tried to use their performance as sort of a play to showcase their support for Palestine against Israel.
Yeah. They come from this a very similar European movement, basically. But it's really this anti-establishment punk movement.
Right. So yeah,
as you said before, I think it's interesting that we had 2 LGBT acts that really shook the European pop landscape from Russia.
yeah,
But in very different ways, and especially having very different roots. The first one, T.a.T.u, being a very clear product of capitalism,
yeah,
and not very genuine, aside from trying to sell
yeah.
as many albums as possible, whereas the other having no financial interest at all. I think it's very telling when you look at the faith of T.a.T.u and the faith of Pussy Riot.
Exactly.
Because half of the Pussy Riot members ended up in jail.
They did. Also, they were the first Russians to be awarded the Peace Prize, named after John Lennon, for protecting the rights and the freedoms of people in the civil society. And that's very interesting, because none of that obviously was given to T.a.T.u.
What it kind of reminds me of is that T.a.T.u and Pussy Riot, in different ways, kind of embody what the LGBT culture in Europe became at some point. Having basically, on the one hand, the very commercial camp, and on the other hand, the anti-establishment. When you look at the gay parades in Europe, they all started in a very Pussy Riot-like manner.
All right.
Like giving a finger to the government, giving the finger to the establishment, and organizing these gay parades in the Netherlands and Germany with the message, we don't give a fuck what politicians think of us, we're doing whatever the fuck we want.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas when you look now at the LGBT parades in Western Europe,
it's mostly very well organized.
Very well organized, very commercial. Some of the most prominent Dutch and German banks sponsor the gay parades.
It's almost, actually, I think it's going to be very bad for your podcast, but it kind of reminds me of Christmas, really. No, because like up until some point it was this very small holiday with, celebration within the family, sometimes even against the law at some points of history, and now it's a commercialized product.
I think it's a very good comparison. Every cultural phenomenon starts as something that potentially clashes with the establishment,
right?
And then it becomes a product that can be used to actually spread your influence and your power. We see 2 very different acts in LGBT pop music, having from Russia, having had quite an impact on the LGBT culture in Europe. The first one, T.a.T.u, had a very powerful impact on appropriating homosexuality or LGBT culture into the mainstream in Europe. And the latter one really made us realize again what art and music in general can do against a political establishment that seems unbeatable, but actually can be so easily destabilized by just entering a church and filming yourself. Really, like no shot has been fired, right? But it seems to not have had that impact on Russia itself.
No, I don't think that it had that much of an impact on Russian society. However, obviously there are so many more people that are aware of the feminism as a movement now, which is a good thing, to my mind overall. There are so many people that are aware of the fact that there is a possibility to, as you said, to shake the establishment just a bit, just by entering a bloody church. Well, many things happened in 2012. Bolotnaya Square happened, this thing happened, and Bolotnaya is basically the first Russian protest that was this well organized as the last protest in Russia war. And I think in the combination, these two give us a very deep change in the understanding of the liberals of what kind of actions they may take towards shaking this establishment. Maybe that was the result.
Lastly, a much more general question that puts this subject in a broader context, and maybe for that reason also a much harder question. So I don't expect a very accurate answer. How come that Russia manages constantly to actually have a crucial impact on the European art landscape, while being most of history on the periphery of Europe? And I'm now not only referring to today's era, but I'm also referring to, for instance, the Russian literature,
Indeed.
Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, but also the Russian classical music, right? Russia always had a surprisingly big influence on European art, while politically never really being at the center of Europe at the same time.
I see what you mean. I mean, at any time, somehow, Russia has always been on the radar. It has always been, despite the fact that geographically, politically, and economically, it has always had this burden against Europe. It has always been on the foresight. I think that comes culturally from... If you think about a Russian person, what do you think of? I mean, not physically, but mentally.
Mentally?
Yeah. What do you think makes a person Russian?
Well, I've lived in Moscow for a while.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. But I can't escape really stereotyping in this case. But I would say Russians generally tend to be, because they are always on the sideline of Europe, and for that reason always are forced to observe Europe from an outsider's perspective, they tend to understand things more quickly than Europeans themselves.
I would say not necessarily quickly, but indeed deeper. Well, Russians had never had an easy life or an easy way of living.
And it was always less easy than that of most Europeans.
Of course, yeah, and because of that, we tend to see a bit more, we tend to feel a bit more, we tend to think a bit more. Maybe that's the case. I'm not saying I'm by no means saying that Europeans are not experienced enough or anything, not at all. But thing is that the fact is that in the last couple of centuries, Russians had suffered so much as not any other nation, I think.
In Europe,
in Europe at least. Yes, and from that perspective, we like to observe, and the way we observe might appeal to the Europeans. As I said, with T.a.T.u, it was the question of management, and the management was brilliant, the kind of management that the Europeans themselves didn't come up to. I mean, in 2002, who would think of putting a lesbian group singing "I'm going mad, I cannot live without her,"
making out in the center
in
of
the center
stage.
of the stage?
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think what you said about like that Russians have suffered more than any other European, but at the same time have always been influenced by the same ideas as other Europeans.
Right.
So Russian literature was like French and German literature, influenced by the same kind of styles, the same kind of philosophies, but they had to combine it with an environment that was severely worse and often kind of contradicted the kind of luxury ideas that Europeans could busy themselves with, at least Western Europeans. And the same comes for LGBT, right? How can you actually start thinking of LGBT issues when you as a society and when your citizens or the average citizen has to worry how to fill the fridge at the end of the month?
Exactly. And I think Russia will come to a point when most of the citizens will understand that the LGBT community is a part of the society and their rights are human rights. But until that, all of the tattoos and all the Pussy Riot activities, Pussy Riot-like activities, will seem a bit of a provocative nature, and maybe that's a good thing so far.
Yeah. Roman, thank you a lot. To you guys, see you next time.
Thank you very much for hosting me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes, likewise. Thank you. So we got a lot of comments after the last episode. Not surprisingly, most of them were coming from Greeks. And thank you so much for these comments. It really means a lot to us that people from the other side of Europe are actually listening to our episode. The biggest criticism that we received was that I called Syriza far left at many occasions during the podcast. I should have been more careful in giving them a political label, and calling them far left in today's context really is some kind of denial of the actual political reality in Greece. So I withdraw that. I will be more careful in describing Syriza and other parties in Europe, really, because parties change. Events force parties to change their ideology. Other comments were of a more historical nature. Both Greek and Macedonian listeners argued why it was legitimate or not legitimate to call North Macedonia a Macedonian country. I very much respect both opinions, and I just think that these comments underline why it is such a painful and sensitive subject. Anyways, guys, thanks so much for commenting. It really indicates that these topics are very important to talk about, and as I might have argued at the very beginning of this podcast series, they are not discussed enough really in European media. So we are very happy to engage you and ourselves into this debate.